Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director of the museum. And today, let me introduce our special guest, fighter pilot, combat veteran, test pilot, author, and good friend to the aviation museum community. These are just a few of the wonderful qualities that characterize our speaker for today. And did I mention interesting conversationalist? So, in order to make the maximum use of time, I am going to step aside and yield the podium to George Merritt.
I'm going to ask you a question. This is an aviation group, so somebody should be able to be smart enough to answer this question. The question is, what is the greatest unsolved aviation mystery? Amelia Earhart, no. What else could it be? Some people might say the Bermuda Triangle. No. How about Roswell? No. The greatest unsolved aviation mystery is why Japanese kamikaze pilots wore helmets. Didn't make sense to Skyraider pilots. Well, I'm going to talk primarily about my book, Cheating Death, and my year of combat in Southeast Asia. This is my first introduction to aviation. I'm the little guy on the left there. This is during World War II. I'm probably 7 or 8 years old. My next door buddy, Bob Preston, was a year older than me and about a head higher. And the war was raging. My first remembrance of life really has to do with World War II, with blackouts that they had, with the rationing of fuel and sugar and meat and all of those things. But I wanted to be a pilot, as did Bob Preston, my buddy. Parents had bought for us the leather helmet, some goggles, and we'd go out and we'd play fighter pilot, and that would be chasing each other around. So I was pretty good. I was a good runner, so I could run Bob down. But we also played bomber pilot. We were living in a town called Grand Island, Nebraska, the middle part of the United States. There was a B-17 base at our town, later became a B-29 base. So these big bombers would fly over in formation, and so we would occasionally play bomber pilot. And Bob always had to be the pilot. I had to be the co-pilot, partly because he was a year older. But I asked him one time why I couldn't become a bomber pilot, and he said because I didn't have a whistle. He had a whistle that was on a chain on his overalls, and he said you have to have a whistle to become a bomber pilot. And I didn't have a whistle. I wasn't a bomber pilot. As it turns out, that's okay. I'm glad I wasn't. But that kind of set the hook for me was aviation in World War II. As you certainly know, it was aviation that really won the war in the Pacific and in the European theater. And so right from a very early time period, I wanted to become a pilot. Well, time went on. I went to college, joined ROTC. Back in the 50s, if you weren't in ROTC, you couldn't get a deferment to stay in college. And your final 2 years, you could get a deferment, but I decided to go into advanced ROTC. Went through, graduated from college, ended up going into the Air Force and went through flight school, flew the T-34 to solo, later the T-33, advanced flying school, the F-86, my first permanent squadron, Hamilton Air Force Base up in the Bay Area, flying the F-101B Voodoo. And stayed there for 4 years and applied for the test pilot school and got accepted for the school in 1964. By then it was, Chuck Yeager was the commandant of the school, and it was a one-year school. Test piloting had been an 8-month school, but they moved it back to 6 months, so we went 6 months of test pilot and 6 months as space pilot, because Chuck Yeager was going to have his own manned space program versus NASA, which had the manned space program at the time. So going through this is the test pilot school, 1964, I got a chance to fly the F-104 Starfighter, and part of our training there was putting on a pressure suit and zooming the airplane up to 80,000 feet to get a kind of a feeling for what it would be like to fly high altitude in a pressure suit. I graduated from the test pilot school and went into fighters, and at Edwards spent 3 more years in fighter test there. Got to fly the early Air Force's F-111s, F-5s, and F-4s. And the other thing we got to do is chase the B-70 and the X-15 and all the other airplanes that were flying out at Edwards during that time period. So by then I'd been married a few years, had 2 small boys. The war in Southeast Asia was starting to brew up and people were going off to war. You could volunteer to go to war or you could not volunteer, but you could be selected to go. And I wasn't going to volunteer because according to McNamara, it was supposed to be over in another 6 weeks. You probably remember hearing those too. Well, it wasn't, and finally I got assigned Combat Southeast Asia in a tailwheel prop. Airplane about the size of a P-47. It is a tailwheel, big radial engine. There was a couple at a Chino air show a couple of months ago. Anyhow, I'd never flown a tailwheel prop. We were operating off of pierced steel planking, 15 weapon stations. You can see it had about a 25,000 pounds, carried as much weapons as the B-17 of World War II vintage. And a variety of ordnance we carried for this. This was a strike mission. I was stationed initially at Udorn, Thailand, which is the northern part of Thailand. There were 5 or 6 Air Force bases there. Primarily, the big airplanes were the F-4s and the F-105s that were interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, moving supplies south to South Vietnam. That was during the bombing halts. Then when the bombing halts were off, everything was up and they were striking up in North Vietnam. So our area of responsibility out of Udorn as a Sandy pilot, we flew strike missions in northern Laos, and then rescues in northern Laos, and we went only to rescue pilots, Navy and Air Force pilots that were shot down over North Vietnam and the northern part of Laos. Now there's no friendlies on the ground, at least no American friendlies. Air America was floating in and out, and Laos was a neutral country. So the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese were not supposed to be in Laos. We weren't supposed to be in Laos. They were in Laos, we were in Laos. And it was, whenever anything happened, it was just said that something happened in Vietnam. In fact, it was Laos. At any rate, just a little bit about this airplane. As I mentioned, 15 weapon stations besides we had the 4 20-millimeter guns. So we carried, this happens to be a fuel tank. These are bombs and rockets with fuse extenders. It was really quite an airplane. It was, I went to Hurlburt to learn to fly the airplane. An interesting thing has to do with starting a round engine. It's not like a jet where you hit a button, start, throttle around the horn at 12, 15, whatever percent, and it cranks up. This is a bugger to get started. It's 18 cylinders on it, and it's very easy to backfire it if you don't have quite the proper setting. As it turns out, the unofficial game was that you owed a case of beer to the ground crew if you backfired on start. So they always left the throttle in a position where it would backfire if you had had a little too much to drink the night before and hadn't adjusted. So it wasn't really the easiest one to start. Matter of fact, I kind of felt like if I could get the engine started, that was probably half the mission right there. An interesting sideline to that has to do with after I wrote my book, Cheating Death, came out in 2003. I'm a member of the Society of the Experimental Test Pilots, and so is Neil Armstrong, the first man to land on the moon. So I thought, what the heck, I'll send him a copy. I had his address, so I sent him a copy of my book, Cheating Death, and lo and behold, a month or so later, I get a letter back from Neil Armstrong. And he said, you know, I flew the Sky Raider in the Navy. When I was an ensign, one of the first assignments I had stationed on the West Coast was picking up Sky Raiders from the factory in El Segundo and ferrying them to Navy squadrons on the West Coast. And he said, I never was able to start a Sky Raider engine by myself. I always had to have a plane captain help me start that. And so I thought to myself, in his mind, it was more difficult to start a Skyraider engine than it was to land on the moon. We all have kind of different what was hard and what was easy in our life, and he thought starting the Skyraider engine was. So I thought that was just kind of an interesting sidelight having to do with the airplane. So our missions, like I said, were primarily strike missions under the call sign of Firefly up in northern Laos. However, if a Navy or Air Force airplane gets shot down, then we become Sandy rescue pilots. We had a different ordnance load. We had airplanes that were on alert. The Jolly Greens at that time period were operating out of Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, a different base. And matter of fact, when I was stationed in Southeast Asia, after 2 months, we moved from Udorn over to Nakhon Phanom, and called River City. It was right next to the Mekong River. And so we were jointly located with the rescue aircraft. I'll describe a little bit of what it was like. This, in fact, is the Mekong River, which is the dividing line between Laos and Thailand right here. This is a C-130 Crown aircraft, a Jolly Green HH-3. As you can see, they could in-flight refuel, which we couldn't do. And it was interesting to watch them in-flight refuel with the helicopter. And they were faster than we were. So they could, in some cases, if we got scrambled at the same time, get close to the survivor area than we could, or faster than we could. So what we did is we kept 4 of the Skyraiders on alert on the ground, along with 2 Jolly Green helicopters. The idea is that when an airplane goes down, most military airplanes that were flying over there, except some at night doing photo recon, flew in groups of flights of 2 or 4. So usually one airplane goes down and the wingman or the lead or somebody knows that a guy has punched out, has watched the parachute, heard the beeper, circles their kind of on-scene commander until we can arrive. And so they contact the command post, and off we go to make the rescue. The way it was set up is we called it like a stagecoach robbery. We're not out to take over land and hold the land. All we want to do is put ordnance on the area, get the enemy to keep their heads down, let us get our guy and get the hell out of there. Leave Dodge as quick as we can. So what we do is the Sandy 1 has a wingman, Sandy 2. The 2 of them head directly for the last known location of the survivor. Sandy 3 and 4 escort the 2 Jolly Greens to a holding area maybe 5, 6, 7 miles away from where the guy was shot down. We use 2 Jolly Greens because if one goes down, then the other one is the backup. And so Sandy 1, which is the most difficult position you could ever imagine, and I'll compare it to a quarterback of a football team. Think of yourself as the quarterback and you never have a huddle. Everybody's moving all of the time, and somehow you have to make sense of all that. So Sandy 1 is flying his airplane, watching for ground fire, communicating as best he can with the survivor who's on the ground with the handheld radio. And he wants to know from the survivor what kind of signaling devices he has to help for the rescue. He wants to know whether there's enemy located around where he is. If he's up in a tree, does he hear the enemy below the tree? Does he know what gun shot him down, anti-aircraft gun, where they might be located? He wants to know whether survivor's hurt or not. If he's got a broken arm, if he's bleeding, if he's having problems like that, then that's going to materially change the kind of rescue that we would do. Meaning that if he needs help, when the Jolly Green goes in there with goes into a hover, there's a pararescue man that can get on the penetrator and go down. The penetrator is on about a 200-foot cable hoist and can be run up and down, not really fast. So it's going to take a time to get the hoist down, get the PJ over to where he is, maybe cut him loose from his harness, give him some first aid, whatever he can do to get him on the hoist, get up and get the hell out of there. So Sandy 1 makes contact with the survivor. If you don't have a radio, it's not looking good because it's very difficult to make a rescue on just a person unless you're really fresh and know that he is who he is. I might also add we could only make rescues in the daytime. We had no night vision equipment. We had nothing but flares, and you certainly wouldn't try and make a rescue on flares. So it was only daytime. So if we get towards late afternoon and nobody has been shot down, then the rescue armada gets airborne out of Nakhon Phanom and starts heading over to Magia Pass or the trail so that if somebody does get shot down, we can move in faster to pick them up. Of course, the problem is the sun sets and you don't have your guy. Then all you can do is tell him, hold tight, strap yourself to the tree, turn your radio off, and come back up at, say, 5 o'clock in the morning, and we'll do what's called a first light. We'll have our group take off brief at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, get airborne at 4, be over the area at 5, and start calling you on the rescue frequency and get ready for the pickup. I might add that some rescues took a short period of time. If a guy gets hit and could fly just even a short distance, these are kind of called karst. They're mountains of Laos. And the enemy, for the most part, on the valleys and the trails for moving down, they didn't go up in the karst that much. So if a guy gets hit and can eject so as to come down the karst, then it's like Coast Guard. You just simply go in and make a pickup and go home and have a drink and let go at that. But if you land in the valleys close to a trail, we got a problem. You got a problem because we're going to have to fight our way in, fight our way out, and you may get captured. So, but we would keep coming. Even if our airplanes got hit, they'd pull off, we'd replace them. So some rescues took as long as 3 days. But it was good morale for the Air Force and Navy pilots to know that if you went down and you were alive and you had your radio, we would keep coming and coming and coming and coming. So we just would not give up. Just a quickie on my first rescue. I'd only been in country a short period of time. Typically, when you first flew combat, you flew 5 missions in a dual-seated, side-by-side Skyraider with an instructor pilot in the right seat. That was your introduction to combat. Once you had passed that and proved you could get your ordnance down there and knew all the codes and knew navigation and could fly formation and could go in and out of weather and could land and take off the airplane, then you were cleared to solo and you became a strike wingman, later to become a strike lead, later to become a rescue wingman, and much later to become a rescue lead. The rescue lead, as I mentioned, was the most complicated thing you could do. Everyone was different, and it helped to have a previous experience. Unfortunately, my first rescue took place within, I think, about 3 weeks in a place called Chapone. A Navy pilot in an A-7 was shot down, first mission, second pass in the Chapone area. I'd never been to Chapone. It was just west of the DMZ. Kind of, if you can imagine, there were several routes out of North Vietnam through Magia Pass and the other passes, Ban Carey Pass, and then it kind of became a common road through Chapone, and then lower than that, it spread out and went into South Vietnam in several places. So Chapone was a really hot area. It's not an area that I had been in strike, but the pilot went down, and I was Sandy 4. What happened to Sandy 1, and it was late afternoon. So we headed over that direction. Within a few moments, Sandy 1 got hit in the engine, and so he headed home with his engine smoking, and his wingman went with him. And so then Sandy 3, I was Sandy 4, we were called in, and I remember seeing Sandy 1 head off to the westbound. The sun had already set, and you could see smoke. He had about 80, 90 miles to go to get back. He did get back, but the engine froze up just as he touched down. So my lead and I now went in, and my lead I was flying above him, watching for ground fire and contacting the C-130 because they would divert all types of resources, meaning other 105s and F4s in the area to help with the rescue. They divert anything you need, you get, we'll divert it. So I was writing down on my card the flights that were coming in, the ordnance that were coming in, banking back and forth. It was dark on the ground, could see where the A1 was, or the A7 was smoking on the ground. And suddenly I see another explosion on the ground and a parachute go into the trees. I thought, uh-oh, what the hell was that? So I called my Sandy lead, no answer, back and forth, no answer. My lead now had been shot down. So now I'm with 4 Jolly Greens. The sun has set. There's 2 airplanes on the ground, a place I had never been before, never been on a rescue before. It was not a good feeling. Terrible, terrible, terrible feeling. So Crown called it off. They called and said, everybody go home, we'll have a first light effort. So now we got 2 guys on the ground. Make a long story short, because this does go on for a while, and I want to talk about a few other things. The Navy pilot, we did finally pick up on the 3rd day, only after he got hit by some ordnance from an F4, dropped, and he got CBUs on him. One radio battery had died, the other one was getting weak, and he said, if you're ever going to get me, get me. So I was involved with the 2nd day, I was involved with the 3rd day. We did make the pickup. My guy by the name of Ed Leonard, who was my lead, I might add just a quickie, he had finished 1-year tour over there and could have gone home, but he got an assignment to B-52s. And he said, I don't want to fly B-52s, so he's extended. He was also going through a divorce, which is quite a story also in my book. So now he gets shot down, and he evades the enemy for a while. That night he said he headed up northwest. The next morning we bombed northwest, but I don't know, he said he did. And he heard the North Vietnamese, they tended to hit sticks back and forth, and they could communicate at night somehow through that. So he decided it was going to become sunrise before long, so he thought the best thing to do is climb up a tree. So he said he climbed up about 75 foot in a tree. This is the first night. And he said he heard the North Vietnamese, and they formed a base camp at the base of the tree that he's in. What are the odds of that? So the next morning, he didn't want to come up on his radio. And of course, we were waiting to hear from him. We don't hear from him. We hear from the Navy pilot, so we go out after him. But we don't hear from our guy. We don't know what in the hell happened. I know that he had got a parachute, got down. I talked with him one time, and he said, I'm resting before I head northwest, crossing the road and heading northwest. You weren't supposed to cross roads, but that's what he said he was going to do. Anyhow, so he climbs up in this tree. The next day when we're out after the Navy pilot, he hears all this explosion going on, but he doesn't come up on the radio. He spends the whole day in the tree. That's it. Spends the 2nd night in the tree. The morning of the 3rd day, he said it looks like they were breaking camp. They could rolling up their bags and talking to each other. And he said, I'll wait till they're gone for 2 hours. I'll come up on the radio. I'll get rescued. He said one of the Gomers, that's what we called them, that was the common name for them, Gomers, he saw down at the base of the tree, and he was rolling a cigarette with paper and the tobacco. He sat on his knapsack there, lit up his cigarette, and looked up and saw him up in the tree. And he said, I tried to be an olive drab banana, but they saw me. And they shot up there, grazed his forehead. And he said, here's the North Vietnamese Army, automatic weapons, base of the tree. I'm up in the tree with a .38 pistol, 10 rounds. Game's over. Dropped the gun, became a prisoner of war for 5 years, but did make it back. It's a hell of a story of what his time that he spent in captivity. So it was hazardous business in rescuing. In the year that I was there, we had 12 pilots killed. 2 were burned so bad they were sent back home. 26 airplanes were lost. 1 squadron, 1 year. Some guys, jumped out of 1 or 2, crash landed them. Somehow I came by. I got hit, but I never was down, never had to jump out of one. I was kind of thinking it'd be kind of fun to jump out of one. Never jumped out of an airplane, thought that'd be kind of good, although I'd make sure I got back in friendly territory to jump. But an interesting thing that I think saved me is the Pentax cameras were coming out at that time period. And my roommate had one, single lens reflex, much better than the camera that I had that I bought for flying chase and when I was a test pilot. And I carried a camera with me then, got some good shots, but not like this Pentax camera. So I carried that with me all the time. And every time I thought of maybe doing something a little dangerous and might have to jump out, I thought, you're going to lose your camera. And I thought, I don't want to lose that camera. It's a good camera. So it was kind of like your mother tapping you on your shoulder and said, don't do that, don't do that. So I think that camera saved my life. This is a photograph of me with my airplane. I say my because my name is on the side. We had nose art on airplanes just like they had in World War II. And of course, we had more pilots than we had airplanes, so you couldn't name an airplane until enough guys had left before you that there was now an airplane available. So I got to name an airplane, and those of you that can remember back in the 60s, remember Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In? Okay, well, there was that saying they had, sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me. Well, I decided it would be sock it to 'em. So changed the E and the M around, and so there it was. Sock it to 'em was on the nose. And again, you can kind of see these are fuse extenders. You can see all the weapons that this airplane would carry from that. So it was kind of neat to name an airplane. We certainly didn't do that at Edwards, hadn't done it any other place in the Air Force that I'd been, but it was kind of neat to be able to name an airplane. Unfortunately, about 2 to 3 weeks after I left Southeast Asia, Sock it to 'em went down. Pilot was on a mission up in North Laos, where there was the friendly Laotians. There was a separate war going on in northern Laos between the communist Pathet Lao and the friendly Laotians. So this was kind of different than the moving of the equipment down the trail, which the North Vietnamese were doing to obtain South Vietnam. There was a war going on up in northern part of Laos. And it was kind of a low level by standards of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This was no airplanes involved except for just a very few helicopters that would drop off road watch teams and and it kind of was a function of the rainy season and the dry season. The dry season, the Pathet Lao would be able to head quite a way south, and then the opposite season, when it got rainy, then they would lose ground. So it was kind of a static war in that sense. We did not do any pickup of people on the ground. We did strike missions. We did close air support, but at any rate, so a major that was flying my airplane, it was an area was being overrun, and during a pass over there, the airplane crashed. And so nobody saw any survivors, but you don't know. Maybe they did get out just as you blinked your eye or something like that. So then, I guess a couple of weeks later, the friendlies got into the area and they went through the wreckage and they managed to find a .38 pistol with the barrel, I'm told, bent about 20 degrees. And they took that back to our personal equipment and read the serial number on the gun, and it was the same as this Major East was carrying. So with that in mind, he was declared KIA. And so there went my airplane. So I thought Sock it to 'em was gone until a few years ago. Before I wrote the book Cheating Death, I had written an article about flying the Sky Raider in Southeast Asia in Wings magazine. Remember, Wings came out one month, Air Power the next. They've been discontinued now, but this story came out in Wings magazine. And so I had taken, with the Pentax camera, I'd taken some really, really good shots, because the other thing that was kind of neat about the airplane, of course, is the canopy will open in the air, and I'll tell you a story about that. So whether I was a wingman or a lead, slide the canopy back, get out there and take a photograph. So this Japanese model company came out and took information off this photograph that was in wings and made a plastic model out of Sakatuums. You can in fact go to a hobby store, pick up a model of Sakatuum that has TT, that was our squadron, all had TTs. My airplane was an A1J029, and you can make a model of Sakatuum. So Sakatuum still lives. I found out a week ago today that now Hobby Master is making a die-cast metal copy of Sakatuum. So old Sakatuum still alive. A story about the canopy being open. It took us about an hour to climb up to 10,000 feet. Hot days, full load of ordnance, the airplane rolled, and slow to climb and everything. And so typically I took a little food with me to eat. So one morning I'm out there with a banana and climbing up, and I went to eat the banana and I opened it up, and the top portion of it had oxidized and was pretty gooey. And I thought, I don't want to eat that part. I want to eat the rest of the banana, but not that part. What the heck can I do with that? I thought, I could bite it off and spit it into my helmet bag. I didn't want to do that. Put it in with my maps and charts. Didn't want to do that. Put it in my side pocket. And then it dawned on me, by gosh, I'm flying an airplane where you can open the canopy. My jets, none of them. I know some Navy airplanes, early jets, you could slide the canopy back. Certainly not the F-14 or the F-18. Nothing I had flown in the way of a jet could you open up the canopy. I might have had a fear of flight if I could have ever opened up the canopy and saw how high it was. But anyhow, I thought, I'll just spit that banana out. That can't be too hard. Now, again, the Sky Raider flew. Took off and landed at about 100 knots, cruised at 10,000 feet, 140 indicated, 165 true. So I opened up the canopy, stuck my hand out there, it's hot as can be, and it's a pretty good blast, So I thought to myself, when I go to spit that thing out, it's going to take a monster spitter. I'm going to get that damn thing all over the tail of the airplane. I don't want to do that. So I got it in my mouth, got up there, and I did a monster spit, and I literally saw that go out like this, and then was all over my face. Well, now it's too late to try and wipe off. I have banana all over me, and I might add, this is one of the flying suits that I flew with. We had 3 flying suits, and they were washed on the shower floor by the Thai maids with a brush. So I ended up with one that I could come home in because we came back in a C-130 into Bangkok before we got a commercial flight home. Any rate, so when I landed and got out of the airplane, of course, the ground crew looks at me and says, "Wow, you got banana all over you, Captain Merritt. Did you fly through a banana tree?" So I told him the story that I just told you, and the one airman who was interested, he said, "Well, Captain Merritt, you made a big mistake." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, the prop's rotating like this, the airflow is coming up, you should have spit out the right side." Well, we as guys, gals don't spit, but we guys do. Why do we spit out the left side? Because we're in cars. Nobody rolls down the right window and spits out that way, particularly if your wife's sitting there, right? So we spit out the left side. So he said, "You should have spit out the right side. That's the way the airflow." So the next time I went back to that airplane, they had put a little placard in there and it said, "Jet pilots, please spit out the right side." Ground crew were really great guys. Another story I'll have to tell you that has to do with me was that I was a pipe smoker at that time period, and the Sky Raider was not pressurized. Matter of fact, for air conditioning, there was a little handle that said cold, and a little handle said hot. Press in, pull this back for hot, and of course airflow over the engine, it gets hot, even hotter than it is in the jungle. Cold is just outside air. Anyhow, I'm flying along and I decided to light up my pipe. There was even a little ashtray in the airplane, courtesy of the US Navy back in the 50s when it first came out. So I'm flying along. I don't know whether I was going out to a mission, coming back from a mission. But at any rate, the other thing that those of you who are prop pilots know is that fuel, this is a 300-gallon center line, when you switch the external fuel there, that goes directly into the engine, not into a feed tank. Jet pilots, all of our fuel goes into a feed tank, then into the engine. So, and this was not monitored. There was no gauge in the cockpit. We also carried a left stub 150-gallon tank for the rescue missions. So the only way you know the tank is empty is when, what? The engine quits. Anyhow, I'm on an external tank, I'm smoking my pipe, and I decided that I had to take a pee. So there was a little funnel in there, and so I unzipped, it might have even been this flying suit, had the funnel up there, had my pipe, and the engine quit. And suddenly the Air Force is very, very big on checklists. And so they have a checklist for everything. And one of the things you always worry about in checking out in an Air Force airplane is that you know all the emergency bold-face procedures and that you're proficient, that you know what to do when the time comes up with whatever the emergency is. So there was no emergency checklist for taking a pee with the pipe in your mouth and the engine quits. But suddenly it was like watching a ping pong game. My hands were moving and I didn't drop the pipe, I didn't pee on myself, and I got the engine started again. And I thought to myself, by God, I am really proficient in this airplane if I can do that. Now, I flew 188 missions in my year of combat. So you flew practically every day, not quite, but practically every day. So you did really become proficient, probably the most proficient I've ever been in an airplane. And we really, hope there's no Air Force inspector in here, didn't use a checklist. You just wouldn't, you use it to start off with, but it's kind of, I've always compared it similar to a musician. At some point, you know your music good enough that if you're in a performance, you don't need your music. You know it. It's in your head. Well, I think the same was kind of true with the Sky Raider. You flew a lot. You knew how to operate the airplane, the engines, the controls, the radios, the weapon system. And so your hands went where they had to be because you wanted to maintain a view outside the cockpit for either your wingman or your lead, your navigation in and out of weather. You've got to keep heads out, so you really got to know the airplane. But yeah, I certainly really felt proficient there. I went over in April of 1968, came back in April of 1969. So I was over there in Christmas of 1968, and this is a photograph of part of Christmas of '68. You'll notice the ground crew are bare-chested, which was against Air Force regulations, but who in the world's going to tell them, put your shirt on? This is also napalm, which we carried, and so for Christmas they had painted napalm red. And so that's how we celebrated Christmas for the most part, except for the next slide. Bob Hope came to our field for Christmas of 1968. And what a great experience. I was actually on Sandy Alert, so I was supposed to be in the back of the crowd with our radio in case we got called, but I did take my Pentax camera and went right up to the front and took a photograph of Bob Hope and his round-eyed girls. Everybody in Asia is slant-eyed, but these were round. And that was quite a sight to see after you've been in a combat zone for a long, long time. Might add that I did get an R&R shortly after that, met my wife in Hawaii. But up until that time period, it was day after day, day after day. No ways to communicate with my wife other than airmail. That took about 5 days to go back and forth. No emails, no phone calls, nothing like that. And so it was quite a deal to have Bob Hope come to our field. So before I call up the next slide, I'll tell you, you've seen what I looked like when I was first interested in aviation in World War II. You saw me when I was at test pilot school, when I first got to Southeast Asia, got my own airplane. This next slide is how I looked when I came back from Southeast Asia. I'll have to say that is not me. But I can tell you who it is. When I came back from Southeast Asia, I went to work with Hughes Aircraft Company in Culver City. This was now vintage 1969. There was a runway there. Howard had bought the land there in the early 1940s in anticipation of the World War II coming on so that he could build things for the war. Of course, the flying boat was built there. The racer was stored there for many years. Anyhow, I went to work with Hughes Aircraft Company, and this guy was part of Hughes, although not at my time. The story is that this was a fellow who came out to the West Coast after World War II. He wanted to get into show business, so he wanted to get into Hollywood and become famous. But until he could become famous, he had a job as a janitor at Hughes Aircraft Company. And so he was supposed to sweep the floors of the flight test division. And I might add, Dick Graylow, who's over here, who Cindy introduced as being with Northrop, worked with Hughes Aircraft Company beforehand, and he and I were test pilots at the same time at Culver City. But this was back in the early 50s, and there were jet aircraft that were operating out of Culver City, even when it was a grass runway in the early time period. Whenever he was in the flight equipment room, he saw these jet helmets, which were pretty unusual, and he wanted to try one on. And he said, no, it's personal equipment, belongs to each pilot, you can't try it on. Well, fast forward to he's become 65, and he's getting ready to retire. Many of you retired from aerospace, and you remember how you do all the things, and the last thing you do is turn in your security badge to the guard when you walk out. So he's waiting there to go, and he says, I'd sure like to put on a helmet. And they said, okay, put one on. So he put the helmet on. Everybody laughed. So he took his teeth out, and they even laughed more. He hadn't shaved for a couple of days. Obviously, the helmet's way too big for him, and got a big charge out of that. So a Hughes photographer took the photograph, and all kinds of captions were put on that for years and years and years. So at any rate, I went to work with, just a quickie to end things up, I went to work with Hughes Aircraft Company in 1969, flew as a test pilot for 20 years. And the interesting thing for me and for Dick at that time period is that many of the mechanics that worked on our airplanes, Dick and I flew a WB-66 together, an F-4 together. We competed, the B-66 had the Hughes version of the F-15 radar. And so we took the airplane to McDonnell Douglas the summer of 1970 for a fly-off competition, won that competition, and the radar on board the F-15 is still the Hughes radar. So there were many mechanics that would talk about flying with Howard Hughes. The senior test pilots, the one Dick and I had were working for, had all been hired by Howard Hughes at the end of the war. And so they were now in their late 40s to early 50s and starting to give up flying. They'd flown the F-86s, F-89s, 102, 106s, airplanes that had Hughes equipment on board, but they were ready to retire. We were now competing and won the F-14 radar, the F-15 radar, the F-18 radar, and we made the radar in the stealth bomber. Dick and I flew a Navy A-3 that had an early version of stealth bomber radar. At any rate, so the senior test pilots had flown with Howard, had taken him places, had flown as a passenger with him, co-pilot, you name it, and there was always these Howard Hughes stories that they were telling. Well, Howard, at the time that we were flying out of Culver City, was in Las Vegas. And pretty well drugged up. None of us knew that, but we were always told by the senior test pilots Howard could fly back at any time. He'd land at his airport. He never called the control tower because it was his control tower. It was his runway. No reason to call it. It's your runway. But of course, times had changed a lot. At any rate, I heard these Howard Hughes stories, and so that's how I ended up writing the second book, which is Howard Hughes Aviator. Actually, I wrote a manuscript that had my 20 years with Hughes Aircraft Company and Howard Hughes, but the publishers broke it up into two books. One, the Howard Hughes Aviator, which they wanted out 2 months before the movie. Remember the movie with DiCaprio, produced by Scorsese? That one came out, I think, in December of '04. So they wanted my book to come out 2 months before that, which it did, and then published later the other book that has the 20 years of time with Hughes Aircraft Company. And then the last book, Contrails Over the Mojave, is a book about the testing out at Edwards, the 4 years that I was there. So just back to kind of finishing up on cheating death and combat in Southeast Asia. I left in 1969, and of course the war did not turn out very good, but those of us that were in an earlier time period, we always said, well, we were winning when I left. We were definitely ahead. If it was like a football game, we were a touchdown, 2 or ahead. The guys behind us must have lost it because we were doing good. But I think we did learn a lot from that. The Air Force learned how to fight at night. Most of the fighting now takes place at night because we have the equipment that will do that. And Hughes made a lot of night vision equipment also. And when you go in to win, as we saw in Gulf War I, but seems to have forgotten now in Gulf War II and Afghanistan. But also the good news is really the war in Vietnam was part of the Cold War. That was the reason we were really there, is the spread of communism, the domino theory. That may not have really been true. It may have really been a civil war between the North and the South, but at any rate, I always kind of considered it was part of the Cold War, and ultimately we did win the Cold War. So that was kind of the good news to come out of that. Bad news is our country, spent billions and billions of dollars over a 10-year time period, kind of like we're doing now. You're better off to have a fast war than a slow war, and it involved it created the inflation of the 70s, which was pretty bad. It probably alienated a generation of younger people, younger than those of us flew combat, because we tended to be older than the young guys that were on the ground. And of course, there's 55,000 names on the Vietnam Wall of people who were killed, and we got about 10% of that in this present activity. But most of all, for me, and the reason that I wrote the book was the 12 guys that didn't make it, that were lost during my time period. The reason I wrote the book was to memorialize the guys that didn't make it, and so that the families have something to read about their loved one. And in some cases, I may not have been able to add to their story, but at least it's the context of how they were lost, what the mission was, where we went, how successful we were, how sometimes we weren't successful. But overall, we rescued more people than we lost. So that was the reason that I wrote the book, and that kind of completes my presentation, short of any questions. I guess I should add, I'm kind of messing on part of the airplane, that we did have a Yankee escape system. The airplane, when it first came out, did not have an ejection seat, but they had this escape system. It had armor plating on the side. It had 6 hours of fuel between all of those, internal fuel and external fuel. It had the 15 weapon stations. So that's the reason it was kind of designated as a good airplane for the rescue role, because it could fly for a long time. It had a lot of ordnance. It could take some pretty good hits and keep going. Even in the engine, typically if you got hit, you could get a little ways down the road before you had to jump. The jets, they get hit, and in seconds they're coming apart. There isn't any place you can hit on a jet that isn't a fuel system, hydraulic line, oxygen line, something bad news. And so it's a jumper. But this airplane would smoke and belch and just keep right on going. I did, on this rescue that I was telling you of the Navy pilot, on the second day I moved up to position number 2, and the lead and I went in, and then some of the low scud came in, so the F-4s and 105s couldn't bomb because they couldn't bomb through the low scud. And so the Navy pilot said, get somebody down here. They're getting close to me. So we went down, and my lead got hit again. Remember, first day the guy got shot down. Now my lead got hit again, joined up with him, and he jettisoned his tanks, and all kinds of oil or something was coming out of the bottom of the airplane. He said oil was coming in the cockpit. but the engine was still running. And he said it's hard to hang on to the stick with hot oil coming spraying back into the cockpit. And finally, he got out a ways, and he said, I'm getting out. And I was in close formation when he punched out. And it was funny because, ejection seat, you're sitting in the seat, and out you go, and then you separate from the seat. This Yankee escape system involved 2 rockets that were right behind your head. So the canopy goes, the rockets light, they spin, they go up, a long cord goes up that's hooked to you. So now you're like a puppet. You're not in the seat, you're like that. And sure enough, it looked like he stood up in the cockpit, and then out he went, and he got a good shoot, and he was floating like that coming down. I knew it'd take a couple of minutes before he'd hit the ground. I was now going to be Sandy lead because my lead had been shot down. And anyhow, so then I looked back at the Skyraider that was nosing over with no canopy and flew formation with it. And I'd heard guys, a lot of guys said I'd seen this airplane crash and this airplane crash. I'd never seen an airplane crash. I saw that one crash, followed it all the way down, and pop, in it went. So there's a lot of experiences you have in flying combat that you'd never, ever, ever have in a lifetime of flying any other way. But one war's enough. One war's enough. I've had mine. If I have time, I could tell you how I got rescued one time without jumping out of an airplane. This is somewhat of a humorous story. I'm up probably halfway through my tour, up in northern Laos on a strike mission, just dropped my bombs and the engine started running rough, pulled up, and was a long ways from home, over 100 miles from home, some pretty good mountains in between. Even at full power, I couldn't maintain level flight. So I jettisoned all the ordnance. I had a wingman. He called the Jolly Green, said, we may have a jumper here. But there was a dirt strip up in northern Laos that Air America went in and out of from time to time. And so one of our pilots had landed there a couple of weeks beforehand. And in the bar, the Sandy Box, where we drank and told war stories, I heard about this pilot who had an oil leak, and the oil was coming up over the windscreen. So he landed on this dirt strip, and unfortunately he didn't realize that it was capped. So he touched down and looked out through the oil in the sunset and thought he was going to run, just kind of like Catalina, thought he was going to run off. So he retracted the landing gear, came to a halt, opened up the canopy, stood up, saw the other half of the runway there. So they was pushed. So I'd heard that story, and that strip was there, and I had partial power. I thought, I'll put it down in that dirt strip. So I had partial power, brought it around, came to a halt, got out of the airplane. My wingman said he'll call the Jolly Greens. They'll be here before long, pick you up, and off you can go. So pretty soon the Jolly Greens did come in. And so I ran back to the airplane, got my helmet, had my gun, my maps, my charts, everything. I get in the Jolly Green. They get airborne. They're heading south. They went across the Mekong River. They're heading towards this base of Udorn. That's where I'd initially been stationed. There was 3 F-4 squadrons there and some Air America there. So I'm actually laying on kind of like a stretcher in the back. My helmet's on, plugged into the intercom. And I thought, well, this will be okay. I'll get to Udorn, have a good lunch there, get on the C-130. I'll be back at Nakhon Phanom, and it's another combat mission under my belt. About that time, they got a call from the command post, and they said, the status of the airplane. I said, I don't know. I think I probably picked up ground fire or something there. And they said, do you think maybe we could get in there and work on the airplane? I don't know. I'm not going to work on it. They said, well, we're going to try and get a C-123 with some mechanics. We're going to land there and try and fix the airplane. If we can't fix it, we'll blow it up, let it go. But if we can fix it, we need a pilot. And you've got the pilot. Take him back. So they did a 180, and they came back to this place, and they landed and dropped me out. And I said, aren't you guys going to stay here? And said, no, it's too dangerous. We're going to get airborne. So now I'm back where I started from, on the ground, watching the sun move, and I'm there with my .38 pistol, flying suit on, just like this. I look like the enemy, don't I? I mean, what can I do? And I see other airplanes around there. I see people, none of which I know what the hell is going on. And the sun is moving, the sun is moving. So finally, The C-123 arrives, and it turns out it was a mag problem. It wasn't hit, so they got it fixed pretty quick, cranked it up, and I took off, and I headed home. And so I landed at Nakhon Phanom, went in to debrief on it, and they said the Jolly Greens are having a rescue party over at the club. So who got picked up? I said, you did. I got picked up? You got to be kidding me. It was a standard procedure. If you were rescued in Southeast Asia, you went over to the club and you bought a round of drinks for everybody involved with your rescue. And of course, you were happy to do that. Your other choice is to stay out in the weeds. And so some guys really, really overdid themselves when they got rescued. So anyhow, I went over to the club, and there were the Jolly Greens were drinking. And so I bought a round to drink, and so the other part of the procedure we had is there's the bar here, and behind the bar is a Jolly Green doll type of thing. The Jolly Green is standing there, and there's some plexiglass on its chest, and with a grease pencil you could put a number. It'd be like 1,234. That's the number of people the Jolly Greens had rescued. So there was this tradition called the changing of the number, which meant that the survivor would be thrown over the bar, and he adds one more to it. So they said they were going to throw me over the bar, and I said, you're not going to throw me over the bar. This was not a rescue. In baseball, it'd be maybe an assist. It wouldn't be a put-out, right? How could you do? And I said, how can you call this a rescue? And they said, we picked you up in enemy territory, which is true. We took you to friendly territory, which was just crossing the Mekong River. That was the dividing line. And because you went, command post took it, we had nothing to do with that. As far as we're concerned, it's an official rescue, because it was a numbers war. It was a body count. This was the opposite of the body count. This was the body saved, and the Jollies kept track of those numbers. So they said, as far as we're concerned, it's an official rescue. And I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, it wasn't an official rescue. And they said, you're going over the bar? And I said, I'm not going over the bar. Well, I went over the bar. They picked me up. I had one of the Jolly Greens' head in my arm, like this, and to keep from going over the bar. Well, he went over the bar too. They just threw us both over the bar. In the process of going over the bar, I didn't completely go over the bar. My forehead hit on the bar here, and it caused a little wound that didn't heal too well, because in a jungle environment with sunshine and everything, it doesn't. So I ended up with kind of a scar right here. And years later, my two young sons asked me what the scar was. And I said, I got it in the war. No Purple Heart, but I got it in the war. So I guess I'm officially rescued in Southeast Asia. A crazy rescue. But that's the way the war was. And maybe all wars are that way.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.